Good evening, everyone. Welcome once again to the Bhagavad Gita Satsang. I am your host, Hari-kirtana, and welcome. I'm very, very happy to be here with you this evening and very happy and honored that you have chosen to be here with me. I see we have a few new people who are joining us live, and I hope you will indulge me by raising your hand. There's a little hand gizmo or thing. Okay, there we go. 1 hand, 2 hand, 3 hands. So this just lets me know that you can hear me. Thank you very much for obliging me in this regard. Let's take care of the rest of our housekeeping. So for those of you who are new, you have audio and viewing options up in your upper right-hand corner. So please adjust them as needed. You do not need to be concerned about your microphone or your video camera because you can see and hear me. I do not see or hear you, but if you have a question, then you can pop your question into the Q&A box. So if you want to take that for a test drive, just to make sure that I can see your comments and questions, please do so. I'll be keeping my eyes on that throughout the evening just to see what you may need to know or want to ask me about, or any comments you want to make on any of the things that we speak about this evening. Last week, we continued, or we began our exploration of chapter 6 of the Bhagavad Gita, the Yoga of Eightfold Mysticism. We spoke about Krishna's definition of the true mystic, that is to say, who is actually accomplished and advanced on the path of yoga, or engaged in the practice of yoga, the role of renunciation in mystic yoga, and how the mind can either be our friend, if we can get it to cooperate with us and bring it under our control, the control of the intelligence or the self, or how the mind can be our enemy. It seems to be an either-or proposition in the Bhagavad Gita. There is no frenemy. We covered verses 1 through 7 of the 6th chapter, and this evening, we will continue with the Yoga of Eightfold Mysticism. We're going to talk about set and setting, specifically for this practice, but as set and setting apply in any meditation practice, specifically meditation as opposed to yoga in general, the meditation part of yoga. The set means your internal conditions. And we're going to talk specifically about how equanimity amongst friends and foes alike is part of the internal set that makes meditation and complete absorption in meditation possible. And this has to do with Patanjali's definition of yoga as the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind. And this is particularly challenging, just to get to this stage. So, and Krishna considers that the set, the beginning stage, and then the setting. Yoga props and techniques. How do you set up for your yoga practice in the Ashtanga-yoga system that Krishna is describing in this chapter? We're going to cover verses 8 through 15. Right. Where we left off. We left off with 2 birds in a tree. One bird is eating the fruits of the tree, and some of the fruits are very sweet, some of the fruits taste like nothing, some of the fruit tastes really bad. And the second bird, who is the eternal friend of the first bird, is not tasting any of the fruit. Rather, that second bird is accompanying the first bird to whatever tree they fly to, for as long as they keep flying from tree to tree. And this is an analogy to understand the distinction between the Atma, the individual spirit soul, and the Param Atma, the paramount Atma, the supreme person residing within the heart. And this supreme person is the object of meditation, or the ultimate object of meditation, in the system of yoga that Krishna is about to describe for us. So hence we have this analogy. So let's take a closer look at set and setting and what I really mean when I say set and setting. So the definition of the two together means the context for meditative experiences. So taken together, these two things provide us with an internal and an external environment. And how our set and setting is constructed will have a great deal to do with how successful we are in our meditation practice. And in one sense, the setting is even more important than the set, because the setting can influence the set, whereas the set has a bigger challenge in changing the setting or our perception of the setting. It can happen, but it's more challenging going the other way. The way one of my teachers likes to put it, our environment has a bigger impact on our consciousness than our self-discipline. So the set is our state of mind, our thoughts, our mood, and our expectations. Basically, we go where our minds take us. And the setting is our environment, both the environment of our space that we're in, and also our physical environment includes our physical body, because we are residents within this physical body. So the set involves, first of all, intention. We set an intention at the beginning of our yoga practice when we're practicing on a yoga mat. And so we begin there. What is the intention of our practice? Towards what end are we practicing? What is our practice for? In this sense, we begin with the end in mind. There are three categories of knowledge in the Vedic yoga system: knowledge of relationships, knowledge of practices, and knowledge of the ultimate goal. So our set begins with knowledge of the ultimate goal, knowing why you are engaged in the practice of meditation in the first place. Beyond that, now it is a question of, what is your psychology? Are you naturally an extrovert or an introvert? If you are an extrovert, then turning inward may be a little more challenging. If you're an introvert, it may be a little more, it may be a little easier. What's your state of mind? Are you feeling happy or are you feeling sad? Either one of these can become a preoccupation, happiness being a more natural state of being, a more natural condition for the spirit soul. Is probably easier to accommodate in meditation. We become content when we're happy, or more contenter. Sorrow can be a motivation, but because it's a less natural condition for the spirit soul, it can be more of a distraction. Are we angry or are we content? I've been thinking about this one a lot lately, because as of this webcast, this recording, if you're listening to this later, The topic of anger and who is allowed to be angry and express anger has been part of the public discussion. And so, if there is anger, is it suppressed anger? Is it righteous anger? Is it justified anger? And how do we deal constructively with anger and the causes for anger in relationship to a meditation practice? I hope to circle back to this issue from the standpoint of not only our internal set, but our external setting from the standpoint of the society in which we live. And here I'm speaking about contemporary United States of America and what is going on. That has made a lot of people very angry. In fact, I think everyone is angry. It's just a question of which flavor of anger are you currently engaged in consuming. Contentment, of course, is a principle of yoga. It's one of the personal observances, and cultivating contentment is actually a very challenging thing. To be able to accept what one has, to not covet what someone else has, to not be envious of those who have something you want, to develop a certain constructive indifference to the acquisition of stuff, or to, for that matter, making changes simply according to your own preferences, likes and dislikes. Which brings us to ethics and morality. Is it, do the things that are the things that one is angry about have to do with something that is genuinely wrong? Or is it one side of a coin that, objectively speaking, is just as right or wrong as the other side of the coin? How do we balance this out? Yoga encourages detachment. We've been speaking about this now for some time, and particularly in the recent sections of the Bhagavad Gita, this idea of becoming detached. And so does that mean that we let go of legitimate feelings, valid responses to things that are going on around us? Not necessarily, because yoga, the whole purpose of yoga, is to put an end to suffering. And if we see something causing suffering, well, then we're disinclined to just let it go. We want to do something about it. And there are different levels of suffering and different levels of dealing with suffering. Now, in this particular section of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is actually speaking about the practice of yoga for a renunciate, someone who is saying goodbye to the world, like, I'm out of here. My protest is that I'm not participating in any of it, and see you later. So I think that as we look at this chapter, this is something we should take into account. We have already spoken about action yoga. Yoga for those who are engaged directly with the world and turn their engagement into yoga. What Krishna is speaking about in this chapter is different. This is the turning away from the world that Arjuna thinks might be more his cup of tea than engaging in the battle he does not want to fight. So as we move through this chapter, I hope you will keep that in mind, that this particular section is specifically about and instructions for the practice of yoga in a condition of renunciation, going off to the woods and leaving the world behind. And then finally, affirmations and prayer. What future are we moving towards, and how are we affirming our commitment to creating that future and making that future our present reality, bringing a conception of where we want to be into where we are. And then the entering into a life of prayer. Remember, the object of meditation that Krishna is recommending in the Bhagavad Gita and that Patanjali is recommending in the Yoga Sutras is Ishvara, Param Atma, the Supreme Lord within the heart. And it is natural when engaged in a relationship or activating a relationship with the Supreme Person, that prayer might be part of how you set your consciousness in your for your meditation practice. The setting. As I said earlier, environment is going to have a bigger effect on your consciousness than just your willpower. It is possible to overcome obstacles to yoga in one's environment by willpower, but it is much easier to engage in spiritual practices when the environment outside is conducive for such spiritual practices. And in fact, in terms of engagement with the world, our interest ultimately is in making the world an environment that's conducive to the spiritual elevation of everyone in the world. And whether or not we think something is right or wrong from an ethical or moral standpoint, or good or bad, that's our standard of judgment. Is this going to help people make spiritual advancement? So we'll talk specifically about what Krishna has to say about the best environment for performing yoga and meditation in the verses coming up. The time of day makes a big difference. There are three sandhya, meaning three junctures or connecting points. That period of time when the sky is just about to get light prior to the sun coming up over the horizon is the ideal time for meditation. Noontime, stop in the middle of your day. Come back to your intention. Come back to your purpose, that reason why you are performing yoga, and then engage in a yogic practice. And then sunrise, as the sun dips down over the horizon and the sky is still got some light in it, and just before the stars start to appear. The place. The best place for yoga is some place that is, first of all, clean, cleanliness being next to godliness. Saucha, purity, is one of the niyamas, the personal observances of yoga, and finding a place that is sanctified, that is cleansed, both in terms of physical cleanliness, but also sort of vibrational cleanliness as well, is ideal. Now, I can tell you for a fact that one of the last times I was in India, my most intense meditative experience was in the noisiest, craziest place. It was a corner in the bazaar in Jaipur. And there was just so much going on there. And somehow or other, because it was the first moment I had had for a while when I wasn't taking care of a group of people I was with, I found a little bubble of serenity in this crazy atmosphere. So it doesn't always work like this, but this is what the Bhagavad Gita is recommending, which is going to be a little challenging for those of us who live in cities. The place should be simple, and it should be quiet, which is just the opposite of that corner in the bazaar in Jaipur. And then, so we have time, place, and then circumstance. The situation of your physical body, your physical health will also determine whether you are able to concentrate or whether you will be distracted, and then your posture. How are you holding yourself? So Krishna will be pretty specific about some of his recommendations here. Now the set was actually, how Krishna describes the set began a couple of verses back from tonight's verses in verse 4. So I'm just going to reread those, and that will, I hope, allow you to make now a connection between what Krishna is describing in these verses and how that relates to the set, your internal state of being. So this is verse 4. One is said to have ascended to union with the Supreme when, having renounced all material desires, one neither clings to the objects of the senses nor to action in pursuit of such objects. So there's your first internal set. Neither clinging to the objects of the senses, nor feeling inclined to pursue the objects through action. Text 5. One should elevate oneself with the help of the mind and not degrade oneself. Indeed, the mind may be the friend of the self, or just as certainly the self's enemy. So here's your second set. The intention to elevate this oneself by the mind, rather than let the mind degrade the self by just following the senses towards their objects. Text 6. The mind is the best of friends to one who has conquered the mind. For one who has failed to do so, the mind, out of enmity, will remain a tenacious enemy. So the befriending of the mind through control of the mind is your internal set. Whereas if you are living with an enemy in your house, that is a very different kind of set, not so conducive to meditation and yoga. And then 7, one who has conquered the mind reaches the Supreme Self within the heart and attains tranquility. For one so situated, heat and cold, pleasure and displeasure, honor and dishonor are all the same. So a state of tranquility, of equanimity, irrespective of external circumstances, is the last internal set in the verses prior to the verses that we're going to look at this evening, which begin with verse 8. And so now I will read through all of the verses we're going to cover, and then we'll go back through them individually and get into some more detail. So, text number 8. One who is spiritually situated by virtue of both acquired knowledge and realized knowledge, who has conquered the senses, and who sees a clump of earth, a common stone, or gold, all as being of equal value, such a person is said to be fixed in yoga. Text 9. Those who are even more advanced see well-wishing friends, kind-hearted benefactors, enemies, disinterested parties, neutral mediators, the saintly and the sinful, all through a lens of steady intelligence. Text 10. Now, we're going to pivot. Those verses continued to speak about the internal set. Now we're going to change to the external setting. So text 10, living alone in a secluded place, free from material desires and possessiveness, with mind and body vigilantly controlled, a transcendentalist should direct their full and complete attention exclusively toward the self in relationship with the Supreme. Text 11. To practice yoga, one should go to a holy place and prepare a stable sitting place that is neither too high nor too low by laying kusha grass on the ground and covering it with a deer skin and a soft cloth. Text 12. Then the yogi should sit firmly on this seat and, for the sake of self-purification, practice yoga by keeping thoughts and sense activity restrained and the mind actively focused on a singular point. Text 13 and 14 together. With body, neck, and head aligned, steady, without movement, with vision focused on the tip of the nose and nowhere else, a yogi thus brings their consciousness to me, the ultimate goal. With tranquility of mind, free from fear, and firmly established in a vow of chastity, such a yogi remains linked to me. Text 15. One whose subdued mind is always absorbed in union with the Supreme transcends the forest fire of material existence. Residing in my spiritual abode, one thus attains the highest peace. Once again, if you have any questions about anything that I have covered thus far, about halfway through our proceedings, please go ahead and pop your questions or comments into the Q&A box. Some of you may have different translations that imply different things. And so if you're looking at a translation that differs from the translation I just shared with you, then please go ahead and let me know so that we can see how these different translations compare and what the significance may be. All right, we have a question about deerskin. Deerskin, really? Yeah, a reasonable question because ahimsa, nonviolence. We assume that a yogi does not, as a general rule, go out and kill a deer just so they can sit down and meditate. So Terry, thank you for your question. The idea here is twofold. First of all, the deerskin has to come from the body of a deer who has already died a natural death in the forest. So here's the first thing. You're going to the forest. If you can find a deer in the city or in suburbia, then more power to you. But then you have to skin it. It's already dead, so it won't hurt. And then you lay the deer skin down on the top of kusha grass. Kusha grass is a particular kind of grass that has properties that also contribute to the purpose of the whole setup here, which is that you're in the forest and you're going to sit down and you do not want to move for a very long period of time. And so this combination of kusha grass and deerskin is actually a deterrent for creatures. The idea is that different kinds of crawly creatures who inhabit the forest will not approach you from the perimeter of your seat if you have laid out your kusha grass and deerskin, and even if you've put a cloth on top of it, you don't want to sit directly on the deerskin. You want to sit on a soft cloth on top of that. So that's the idea of the deerskin, and that's where the deerskin comes from, and that's why you use that. You can also use a tiger skin if you live in a place where you're likely to come across a deceased tiger. Terry, I hope that answers your question. So let's go back and look at these verses individually and see what we find. So text 8, one who is spiritually situated by virtue of both acquired knowledge and realized knowledge. So this is something I've spoken about before. Jnana, knowledge, and vijnana, realized knowledge. And here is where Krishna specifically uses those two words side by side. So jnana meaning book knowledge, scriptural knowledge, theoretical knowledge, and vijnana, wisdom, experiential knowledge. And it takes the two of them to be spiritually situated. So one who is spiritually situated by virtue of both acquired knowledge and realized knowledge, who has conquered the senses. So our normal condition of material consciousness is one of being the servant of the senses. The senses make a demand, send the information to the mind, the reservoir of the senses, and the mind sends the information to the intelligence, and the intelligence goes about figuring out how to satisfy the demands of the mind and the senses. But here we're reversing this. It is actually imperative for the practice of yoga that one gain control over one's senses, that one does not simply say how high every time the senses say jump. So presumably, by this combination of knowledge and realized knowledge, one comes to understand the importance of controlling the senses, and by practice, particularly the practice of engaging the senses in activities of devotion, one begins to acquire a taste for spiritual life that supersedes the pleasure derived from the senses, the material senses. So this is how we spiritualize the senses, or one way. But in this description, we are now speaking about someone who is situated at a level of yoga where that action has already been performed and the heart is now sufficiently purified and the senses sufficiently spiritualized so that it is possible to have control over the senses rather than be controlled by the senses. As Krishna eases into this description, he's actually starting with the highest level of yogic attainment in Ashtanga-yoga, and then working his way back to the beginning stages. So, just so you know where Krishna is at with this. Okay. Such a person who has conquered the senses, spiritually situated, sees a clump of earth, a common stone, or gold, all as being of equal value. And such a person is said to be fixed in yoga, as opposed to be aspiring to yoga or practicing yoga. it is pretty difficult to see all these things as being equal. I was engaged in a email conversation with someone earlier today about different conceptions of yoga and different ideas about whether we are meant to be devotees of God or whether we are supposed to meditate on God in order to realize we are God. And there are so many different variations on this theme. And my conversation partner asked me via email, what do you say to someone who is convinced that we are all God? And my response was, I say to them, give me your wallet. Because if I spend your money and you spend your money, it's really the same because I'm you and you're me. And so there's really no difference. So hand me your credit cards. And besides, you're God. You're the owner of everything. You possess everything. What does God need with money anyway? Completely satisfied. No need for God to have any money. So give it to me. And then we very quickly find out just how advanced a yogi such a person is and how committed they are to that particular line of thought. I'm sure Deepak Chopra wouldn't mind one bit if I went out and bought myself a Ferrari on his Black American Express card. Anyway, that's what I say to that. So this is a fairly advanced stage of yoga to really be that renounced, to be genuinely unimpressed by gold, and to think of it as having no greater value than a clump of earth or a common stone. Next verse is the one we're going to chant this evening, so let's go back to our shared screen. And for those of you who are new, the way we do this is I chant one line, you chant that line back. I'll explain a little bit about the diacritical marks, all of the little dots and dashes that you see here in the transliterated Sanskrit, the Sanskrit rendered in the Roman alphabet. A dot under an R is a R sound, or a Ri sound if it has a bar across it as well. So kind of an RI, but a trill, the one trill R, Ri. A bar above a vowel means an open and elongated version of the vowel. So in the case of an A, it would be an A instead of an A. With an I and E, like a double E instead of an I. A dot under an S is an SH sound, a common SH sound, sh, as in she. And what else do we have here? An accent mark, an apostrophe-ish thing. Over an S is a different kind of SH sound. It's a lower pitched pink noise instead of white noise sound because it's pronounced a little further back in your mouth, as opposed to sh. And that ought to do it for, also a Y at the end of a word will usually run right into the vowel that begins the next word. So you'll see that right away in the first line. A V at the end will also have kind of the same effect. So here we go. I chant, and then you chant back. Suhrin mitrar yudhasina madhyastha dveshya bandhushu sadhushvapi cha papeshu samabudhir vishishyate. All All right. So let me point out just a few things in the Sanskrit that are, I think, of particular interest before we go to the translation. The first line is actually a few compound words that speak to well-wishers, affectionate benefactors, enemies. Madhya, in madhyastha, madhya means middle. So that describes a person who's in the middle. That is to say, a neutral party between two people who are not in agreement about something. Dveshya, someone who is envious. Bandhushu, relatives and well-wishers. So bandh as in bandha. Bandha means lock, and we are accustomed to this in asana practice, the idea of locking your bandhas. So family members tend to create the greatest sense of attachment and identification with the body. It's very difficult to gain any detachment from family members. And in fact, we might even question, why would I even want to do that? And yet, we are going to find in this verse that Krishna is actually going to ask us to do something very, very counterintuitive. Sadhu means someone who practices sadhana, or a saintly person, someone who is engaged in spiritual practice, as opposed to papeshu, those who are actively engaged in activities that are sinful, that are hurtful. Sama means same, or steady, equal, equipoised. Budhir, like Budhi, the Buddha is someone who is enlightened, so Budhi means intelligence. So here, Samabudhir means equal intelligence, even equipoised vision or understanding, equal understanding. And then Vishishyate means someone who is very advanced, someone who is very far along. So our fluent translation then is those who are even more advanced, meaning on the path of yoga, see well-wishing friends, kind-hearted benefactors, enemies, disinterested parties, neutral mediators, the saintly and the sinful, all through a lens of steady intelligence. So this describes a very advanced yoga practice, this ability to actually see all these varieties of people with a kind of equal vision and equanimity. Now that does not mean you treat all these people the same. It means, or you don't respond to all of these people in exactly the same way, because you still respond to them in a manner that's appropriate according to time, place, and circumstance. However, you see them in the same way. I went to Europe a couple of summers ago. We were traveling in Austria, and we were in Vienna for a little bit. We were in Prague for a little while, a few places in between. And it was particularly interesting when we were in Budapest to hear about the history, the political history of the place. But I don't really know much about the local politics. I didn't really look into that very much while I was there because, I was just visiting. It's not really going to affect me. When I am done with my visit, I'm going to go home. And in one sense, yoga asks us to look at the world that way. We're just passing through, don't really live here. It's not actually my permanent residence. My permanent residence is in the spiritual world. And I'm a spirit soul in a material body who's just happens to be here for a short period of time due to my karma. But, I'm not really from here, so I'm not going to get all that involved in what's going on here. All right, that's one way to look at it. And I think that's a valid way to look at it. That's not the only way to look at it. This is a both and rather than an either or situation. Now, once again, in this chapter, Krishna is saying, this is for yogis who are like, see ya, I'm out of here. And in many respects, this is not going to be 100% applicable for us. And as we'll see later in this chapter, Arjuna will also have his doubts as to whether or not this is really right for him. Why then does a yogi care about what goes on in the world or in the place that they live, or care about the politics of the place that they live? At this particular moment in time, what we are seeing is a lot of anger. And that anger is being expressed in some quarters as cruelty, as meanness, and in other quarters as anger at that cruelty and that meanness. And why do we care about cruelty and meanness? Well, just as monumental and consistent denial of facts and reality destroys our ability to think, constant exposure to meanness and cruelty destroys our ability to feel, and specifically to feel love. And the cultivation of feelings of spiritual love are what our yoga practice is intended to invoke in us. So if our intention is to awaken love in our hearts and to become a conduit for divine love when we move through the world, then we will probably feel some impetus to act against meanness and cruelty when we see it. In order to do it effectively, and to do it in a way that purifies us and everyone we engage with rather than entangles us, we need a little bit of spiritual intelligence in order to have a proper context for the experience of mean-spirited politics in the material world and the people who are participating in this. If we see them as being the mean, cruel people they appear to be, then we will only get drawn in to this kind of duality of, I like this, I don't like this, you're good, you're bad, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, if we approach that very same situation from a position of, here are spirit souls under the influence of illusion, and who are acting in this way due to their attachments and aversions that conflict with what I understand to be kindness and righteousness and what is moral. Now, you're dealing with that situation from a position of spiritual empowerment rather than from a position of material entanglement. And this is also, as far as I'm concerned, an advanced yoga practice, because it is very easy to slip into identifying with one's own political predispositions rather than looking at people and situations from this lens that yoga gives us. Okay. So that is our particularly challenging verse in this section. Now comes the easy part, going to the forest and laying out a deer skin. So the next verse, a little more detail here. Living alone in a secluded place, free from material desires and possessiveness, with mind and body vigilantly controlled, the transcendentalist should direct their full and complete attention exclusively toward the self in relationship to the Supreme. So this is at that stage of advanced yoga, when one is sufficiently purified and detached that this can work. Whereas if someone is not sufficiently purified and detached, there's no way this is going to happen. So this is called yoga rudha, the cessation of mental activity and engagement with the world in this particular form of yoga, Ashtanga-yoga. So the next one. To practice yoga, next verse, to practice yoga, one should go to a holy place and prepare a stable sitting place, neither too high nor too low, by laying kusha grass on the ground and covering it with a deer skin and a soft cloth. So Krishna is advocating the Goldilocks school of yoga. Not too high, not too low, just right. One should not eat too much, eat too little, just right, etc. Everything in moderation. Ben Franklin actually could have done yoga. We'll see that kind of stuff come up in future verses. Text 12, then the yogi should sit firmly on the seat and, for the sake of self-purification, practice yoga by keeping thoughts and sense activity restrained and the mind actively focused on a singular point. In other words, you need to go off the grid. You can't look at the New York Times every 10 minutes to see what happened. No Politico, no Slate. Just let it go for a while. The world will get along without you paying attention to it. Text 13 and 14, with body, neck, and head aligned, steady, without movement, with vision focused on the tip of the nose and nowhere else. A yogi thus brings their consciousness to me, the ultimate goal. So here Krishna is going to start to draw our attention to himself as the ultimate object of meditation, and not just as a meditational prop, not just as someone or something to meditate on to get to somewhere else, but the idea that meditating on Krishna is the means by which to attain Krishna himself. With tranquility of mind, free from fear and firmly established in a vow of chastity. Brahmacharya is the word that is used here. In this technique or this process of yoga, saying goodbye to sex life is required. You are turning your senses inward, not seeking pleasure through the contact of the senses with sense objects. The ultimate such pleasure, of course, is sexual pleasure. So someone who's practicing this kind of yoga takes a vow of celibacy. And they're by themselves, so still celibacy. Such a yogi remains linked to me. Text 15. One whose subdued mind is always absorbed in union with the Supreme transcends the forest fire of material existence. So the forest fire of material existence, or the transcending of the forest fire of material existence, is translation of the Sanskrit word nirvana. So nir means not, vana means forest, and the implication or the understanding is that nirvana is a state of bliss that exists beyond material existence. And in this case, Krishna uses the phrase nirvana paramam. So paramam means paramount or supreme, the ultimate, like the param atma. So nirvana paramam means the supreme destination beyond the forest fire of material existence, which is his own spiritual abode. Residing in my spiritual abode, one thus attains the highest peace, which translates the word shantim in this verse. And that brings us to the conclusion of our verses for this evening. If you have any questions, now is a really good time to ask them, or any comments on these verses, or as I said earlier, if you have a different translation that you would like to share, then I'd be interested to look at that and see how these translations compare. So just to recap what we've done tonight, well, that's what we did last week. Any questions? Write to me, Hari@Hari-kirtana.com. If you have any questions after the fact, or if you are listening to this recording, please send me questions. I'm always happy to hear from you. Terry, thank you. I'm very happy to be able to spend this time with you. And if you are up around Frederick, Maryland, then I will be even happier to spend time with you on the weekend of October 20th and 21st, where I will be there to do a Bhagavad Gita weekend immersion. So that'll be the Bhagavad Gita in 4 parts on Saturday and Sunday. Please visit Soul Yoga on the internets for detailed information. Next week is what we did this week. So let's see if I have next week on my printout. As a matter of fact, I do. Isn't that convenient? Next week, here's what we're actually going to do. We're going to continue with the chapter, moving into verses 16 through 26. We're going to talk about obstacles to success on this particular path of yoga. We are going to define success. What does success look like when you get past those obstacles? And then Krishna will speak about instructions for beginners. So we are working from instructions for yogis at the highest level, and then working our way down to beginner level yoga for this particular kind of yoga. Hold the phone. Here we go. I said last week that most yoga classes are actually utilizing Buddhist meditation practices. Can you explain the difference? Okay, briefly, Buddhist meditation is a kind of, there are different kinds of Buddhist meditation. There are many different schools of Buddhism. The more popular forms that I'm aware of in most yoga studios deal with mindfulness meditation, which is to say observing the activities of the mind without making judgments. Vipassana meditation, just letting the mind do its thing without interfering. These are passive and more psychological forms of meditation where the mind is the object of meditation. The idea in Buddhist thought in general is to let the mind empty out. The ultimate goal is the extinguishing of desire, because desire is understood to be the cause of suffering, and the ultimate objective is to free oneself from suffering. So the conception of nirvana in Buddhism is a conception of a void, emptiness. And one arrives at that condition of enlightenment when the mind is empty. And yoga is a very different, yoga has a very different conception and a different kind of practice. In yoga, rather than simply observing the mind without judgment, one focuses the mind on an object of meditation that is, in and of itself, purifying and will elevate the consciousness. And that object is the sound vibration Om, or another mantra that is a transcendental sound, not different from the divine object or person that the sound is indicating. So for example, the Hari-kirtana mantra is a mantra that is composed of alternating feminine and masculine aspects of the supreme divinity, the one supreme divinity. And this is what Patanjali is recommending in his Yoga Sutras, and this is what Krishna is recommending in the Bhagavad Gita, that the object of meditation is the Param Atma, the supreme person. And one has to bring the mind under control and actively focus the mind on this object of meditation in order to elevate the consciousness and purify the heart, and thus experience a transcendental reality, a spiritual reality, as opposed to a cognitive nullity, which is what you would get in Buddhism. So it's the difference between voidism or emptiness and spiritual substance in terms of the conceptions of what the goal is. And then the practice is different insofar as the mind is the object of meditation, and it is primarily a psychological practice in Buddhism, and the supreme person is the object of meditation in yoga, as far as the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita are concerned. Now, there are other objects of meditation listed in the Yoga Sutras by which one gains mystic powers. But Patanjali cautions that one can be distracted from the ultimate goal of yoga if one gets caught up in that, and therefore he advises, you can do it, but, and in fact, you will naturally develop these capabilities, but don't get distracted by them. Shanna, does that answer your question in terms of the distinction between common Buddhist practices in yoga studios and yoga meditation as taught in yoga wisdom text? All right. Well, you're welcome very much. Thank you for your question. And thank you all for spending your time with me. I'm very, very grateful and honored that you do so, and very, very happy to be able to spend this time with you. I'm looking forward to seeing you next time. And I'll have a surprise for you at our next meeting next Thursday evening at 8 o'clock. So I'm looking forward to seeing you then. I hope you have a wonderful evening.